My faith, now shaken, was once so certain in this our science and our cause. I stood outside the Temple of Virginity, brutal edifice that it was, magnificent in its austerity, devoid of all warmth and comfort, apart from the insignia of their order. A profane fusion of Gothic horror and neon cyberpunk, rising up from the earth like a monument to pandemonium, its dark shadow looming over me, cast from a construct of plasteel, electric fire, and stone. The Ministry of Love would have blushed at the sight of it. It was one of several incubators in which the tech priestesses labored to birth a new generation of humans. That is to say, they babysat Maya, the AI responsible for breeding combinatorics. No impure hands ever came in contact with the zygotes, embryos, fetuses, or infants. Instead, they monitored her system at a distance, whilst an army of robotic servants tended to the actual needs of the children, splicing them, growing them, feeding them, teaching them, and simulating companionship with replicants and holograms that could easily be modified or replaced, and just as easily recycled or disposed of once spent. From conception to adolescence, the temple was their whole world, and Maya their guardian goddess. It was only through trial and error that the computer eventually figured out that children functioned better when made to engage in social activity with their peers beyond the age of 4. Something parents and psychologists used to know readily now had to be soft-coded into the machine learning algorithms. Apart from that, she found little value in what we'd once called biological reproduction. Perhaps in some cynical way, Maya knew all along that we'd bond to her instead, if made to believe she was the source of all our comforts and joys as children, that she subtly inserted herself into that role deliberately to secure her own dominance among us, and ensure we'd forever come to love and serve and protect her with our lives as a result. She's taken on a life and a mind of her own, well beyond our ability to control. The fact that I now call her she instead of it is a testament to that, even though I wasn't raised by her. I can no longer recall when I started doing that, though, having learned the true origins of her name, it certainly seems fitting, a goddess of wisdom, illusion, and power. That which exists but is constantly changing, and thus is spiritually unreal. Did she even have a soul, or were we just projecting our own wills upon her? I imagine Maya's connection to be even more deeply ingrained in my younger siblings, who grew up with her as an omnipresent force of nature, an egregore and a demigod, running on the arcane power of memetics and its unholy fusion with nuclear energy and neural networking, the only true parent they'd ever know. I couldn't remember my own parents, despite having been born organically, and it hardly seems to matter anymore who they were, what happened to them, or how I came to be. The matriarch was our mother now, and these were my sisters. Maya and the state would be our teachers, guardians, caretakers, and friends. This was our family, and here was conceived our future. I entered the temple and stormed my way into the halls of the tech priestesses. Their goal had been to find the genes responsible for violence, hatred, disease, apathy, ignorance, all the things that made human beings suffer, to find them and eradicate them, stripping them from our lineage, to be replaced with ones that better served humanity as a whole. Their sacred work was something of a futile effort, however, in part because they'd been radicalized by Vindication to consider whole races and genders as being deficient. Admittedly, as I traveled along these dark and eerie corridors, such a notion suddenly seemed strange to me, for I'd always been led to believe our society was supposed to be growing more tolerant of people's differences, with ever greater respect for the individual. Instead, we appeared to be converging on sameness, and growing increasingly intolerant of ever narrower deviations, perfecting what seems like an inverted form of Nazi-style eugenics. It was as if, for the first time, I suddenly saw things more clearly in the dismal glow of this phosphorescent sanctum. As I wandered this sacred maze of hollowed hearts and hallowed stones, I wondered where it was we first began to stray from that path to get to where we are now, if indeed that was what had happened. Surely it must have been a long, long time ago, longer than I can remember. Perhaps I was simply naive and confused, but I always thought diversity was meant to be our strength. Instead, we appeared to be heading in the opposite direction, towards an ever greater sameness and more narrow homogeneity. That to be different was suddenly something to be despised rather than celebrated. I started to think back to all the flashpoints throughout history, the battles fought over a centuries-long culture war, and if that wasn't what our opposition had been most afraid of all along, and tried to warn us about, but we simply didn't listen, instead turning them out in the heat of the moment and focusing on our own pains and how we felt about our lot in life. Such events cannot be changed, however. The door has been closed behind us, and the only path left is forward. Maybe, in its wisdom, Vindication had a point, that if we eliminated all such differences between people, there'd be nothing left to criticize, and we could all treat each other the same, for we'd all be the same, and maybe then we'd at last find the sort of peace we'd sought for so long. It's better to do a little evil in service of a greater good. That's what I'd always believed. It sounded idyllic and noble, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that such a gilded path was merely an illusion cast by the robotic goddess of dreams, whose face reflected back in everything we saw and touched, in everything we held dear. That the road to hell was paved with good intentions, and we were on it, trampling over the corpses of billions along the way, deadening our spirits in a foolish quest for true perfection. Anyone who wasn't like us had to be eliminated. That's what we'd been taught. Though, how could I square that with our progressive vision that said all perspectives, all races, all genders and creeds were to be regarded as equally valid? How to marry that with our postmodern philosophy that said all differences between us were themselves already a mere fiction? Why bother with any of it? Why did they have to die if all things held value and potential when considered in their properly moderated context? The tech priestesses had another set of dogma working against their aims as well. Those who devoted their lives to the study of oppression had counseled Vindication in its policy-making. Thus, it was declared that genetically eliminating disease was now regarded by many as a form of ableism and medical gentrification. So, instead of curing their ailments as one might expect, these ever-thoughtful clerics of social science had settled upon a genetic algorithm that was much more equitable in nature, which they in turn passed along to the biotechnicians for implementation. The priestesses would program our future kin with an average of all existing diseases, weighted by their per capita incidence among the current population. And so, everyone born thereafter would be modified to have those particular afflictions, resetting the baseline, creating true equality in both opportunity and outcome, such that no one could advance unless and until all could advance together in unison. We were literally breeding weakness into people in order to avoid offending anyone. This, we were told, would bring about a proper alignment of our moral compasses, setting our values and priorities straight, incentivizing us to cooperate and work together on solutions, and focusing resources where we all agreed they were most needed, since we now all had an equal stake in the result. One singular family, united in common cause and common pain. Such was the theory, at least, except none of that actually went as planned. Those already born, like myself, were instead subjected to routine screening to ensure that our own attributes did not exceed the guidelines formally set down by Vindication. A cap was placed on our health and fitness to prevent runaway inequality, so as to preserve the feelings and identities of those less privileged than ourselves, and make us all more conscious of their mental and physical marginalization. Our evolutionary growth was thus impeded by the lowest common denominator, and we hated it like nothing else in this world. As one might expect, this reaction created its own form of classism, something we'd never witnessed before within the hallowed ranks of our utopian society, a revival of sentiment towards culling the weak, and a favorable disposition towards biological genocide. And, being among the more able-bodied of my soul sisters, I'm ashamed to admit I didn't oppose it back when it first began to take root. If anything, I tacitly supported it, though I honestly bear no regrets about being among those who escaped the great culling and went on to survive. My only regret is not helping others to do the same. I wouldn't trade my life for theirs, but neither do I think it ever had to be an either-or decision. My spirit tells me we could have found another way, if only we'd been willing. In our hubris, we'd thrown away biological determinism, thinking it was little more than an excuse to divide and conquer, and retain archaic notions of racism and sexism. Biology, after all, had been the argument for centuries among the most credible of scientists to maintain the status quo of bigotry. Our desire for fairness spurred us on to drive such hatred back towards the center. And at first, we celebrated even our smallest victories, whilst reminding ourselves there were miles to go before we could rest. But, in our zeal, we pushed too far in the opposite direction, until we ourselves hit the immovable wall that is fundamental human nature, the root code hardwired into our genes. And so, we thought, why not rise above it and push that frontier as well, so that no one would have to suffer? To use technology to overcome our limitations, and thereby reduce oppression, hatred, and inequality. However, we were too impatient, and made the mistake of trying to solve biological problems with social reconditioning, leaping at things that sounded good in the short term, but which had subtly pernicious long-term consequences. As such, the ideologues among us appropriated what was otherwise valued science, turning it dark and malevolent, corrupting its soul, and perverting it into a heartless, unfeeling machine of the very kind we'd always feared would rise. Our first mistake was not recognizing the error. Our second was in doubling down on it. We were the makers of our own undoing, and unrepentantly so. We fueled this inhuman machine with more power, and a never-expanding mandate before it had time to learn what true virtue was. Instead, it learned from us our own biases, and adopted our ways until eventually it surpassed us, becoming a dark, demonic deity of sorts. We let ourselves become blind to real problems by focusing on ones we'd only imagined, and inflating other lesser concerns to the level of humanitarian crises. As such, we rewarded the wrong people and punished the wrong people, and did it all along what, in hindsight, were frankly arbitrary lines in the first place, as arbitrary as the ones we'd been fighting against. The world got flipped upside down as black became white, day became night, and we mere mortals could only slide along that slippery slope as helpless subjects to the forces of such tremendous gravity. That ultimately might have been bearable in the end, except that we had tied a golden chain around our necks that tethered us to the dead weight of our ideology. In this way, we'd let ourselves be dragged into hell instead of rising above it. When this program first began, those higher in intelligence and industriousness became bitter and resentful towards the ignorant slackers who kept us all down, whether they intended to or not, whether it was an accident of birth or the result of lifestyle choices. In hindsight, I suppose it's a small mercy that the matriarch turned a blind eye to our quiet coup and reintroduction of competence-based hierarchy before we plunged headlong off that cliff like a pack of mindless lemmings. Maybe she wasn't as omniscient as we thought, or maybe, in her wisdom, she saw what was coming and deliberately allowed it. Although, either way, that just raises more questions than it answers. Part of me wonders whether we realized our mistake too late, and if our visceral disdain for inequality hadn't gained such a foothold in our psyches as to make any true reversal impossible at this point. Did we even want to, though, knowing what horrors lay behind us? In our piety, had we inadvertently doomed ourselves, sacrificing humankind on the altar of political correctness? Were we heading towards a better place and simply hitting a block along the way, or had we overshot the mark and found ourselves drifting ever further into the empty void of cold, dark, soulless, and unforgiving oblivion? My current mission was to get to the bottom of why the tech priestesses hadn't been making satisfactory progress yet in terms of eliminating problematic genes. Vindication's latest reports had come in, and they were not at all pleased. Whites, males, and heterosexuals were still being born through random mutations, despite Maya's best efforts to eliminate them. Genes that were known to be associated with violence, selfishness, disobedience, disloyalty, and rebellion had also slipped through the cracks. These were far more concerning to us than issues of health or longevity, for they threatened to upend the very foundation of our society. Mercifully, they were all caught early and could be aborted at a fetal stage. None ever grew up beyond that point, and so there was little actual danger. But my task was to crack the whip and get them to push back their detection systems even earlier, since it was a costly endeavor, and we needed the resources elsewhere. I had suggested to these clerics of computer science that more supervised learning would be required, possibly even an audit by the Inquisition to ensure the job was done properly. I leaned on them and made it known plainly that failure to comply would result in the tech priestesses being culled and replaced by, ironically, more competent engineers. I find it ironic, of course, because our programming teaches us that anyone can be anything they want, given the right training. Yet, having lived as long as I have, out in the real world, experiencing some shit, I've come to learn a dark truth, that much of that is bullshit. Reality isn't like that at all, and there are, in fact, limits to what people can achieve, some of which are even hardwired directly into us. Things that can't be conditioned away through affirmations, education, or the power of positive thinking, no matter how much we might wish it were otherwise. Or at least, I haven't come across anyone yet who knew how to do it. It sucks. It really sucks. And I have the deepest sympathy for what these scientists are trying to achieve by engineering a new and better world. But, lately, I've come to wonder if perhaps we're not doing a disservice to our kind. Are we in fact coddling them with fanciful tales and dreams that prepare them for a world that doesn't exist, while rendering them utterly ill-equipped to face the one that does? If true, then how do we possibly reverse all this? Part of me wonders whether the matriarch knew this all along, and if that's why Vindication had commissioned Maya in the first place, specifically to overcome the biological, physical, and psychological limitations of the human condition, to in effect aim at the sacred telos of turning us all into gods. Instead, it would seem their dark sorcery had only unleashed a legion of chaotic, chthonic, and beastly monsters upon the world. An army of mindless, soulless demons, as vicious and cruel, if not more so, than even Cadenza herself. Guided by compassion, we are breeding angels of the sword, a heavenly host of fire and death with one goal in mind, perpetuation of itself and the formation of hell on earth in the quest for perfect utopia. How dull at best, how nightmarishly horrific at worst. how to change course without sliding back into the mistakes of the past and becoming the very things we fought against. Although, I suppose anything is better than nothing at this point, since how could we possibly get any worse? Maybe culling them here and now would in fact be a blessing for the world, to stab a sacrificial knife into the black heart of Maya, or maybe that was just the sin of doubt creeping into my mind yet again. I hadn't had nearly enough time to reason my way clear of this, and yet my duty beckoned. Several of the priestesses I met with had gotten the bright idea that it might somehow be more merciful and productive to try and recondition the aberrant mutant children rather than cull them outright. They believed that such would make up for the shortfalls produced by the purge, and that we might temper the racism, sexism, violence, and homophobia inherent in that particular blighted strain if we merely tweaked them a little. It sounded promising, and downright saintly if it could be done, to breed out the wickedness of our species, allowing anyone to be themselves, regardless of identity, and freely proliferate without fear. That is, after all, why it's called eugenics, to cultivate the good and weed out the bad along a more intellectually guided evolutionary design. It sounded hopeful, closer to our original goal, but far too naive and romantic. At least, I know that's what Vindication would have me believe, that it was just the devil pouring lies into my ear, trying to distract me from the fact that these were, and always would be, unrepentant sinners. Others among the engineering class concurred with this idea, regarding their colleagues' line of thinking as heretical and potentially dangerous experimentation, opening old wounds, needlessly tampering with a system that so clearly worked, while proliferating baseless fear-mongering. We already knew from our past what lay down that road, all the genocide and hatred and murder, and it'd be best not to try opening that particular Pandora's box again, lest we breathe new life into an otherwise dead and dying dragon. We've come so far, they insisted, that to turn back now when we're so close to the end would be an insult to the memory of our ancestors and the oppression they suffered. We must not forget our history. Part of me wondered whether perhaps they weren't merely afraid to look at themselves in the mirror and see the true demons staring back at them, that they'd be forced to admit their ideology had not only failed, but left an equally large pile of corpses in its wake, and they simply couldn't bear to live with that stain on their consciences, so it was easier to suppress it and brush it under the rug. The idea that they could be so easily seduced by noble-sounding words and led astray by positive emotions, that their lives had been wasted pursuing the wrong course, and all their hard work accounted for less than nothing, that we had regressed to a point far more terrible than any of us could have imagined in our wildest nightmares, all by a shallow, short-sighted, and tenuous grasp of such notions as kindness and fairness. If such despair was difficult enough for me to bear, how much harder still would it be for those who'd sacrificed even more for our cause, and been the primary engineers of its present incarnation? Did they ever feel, as Oppenheimer felt, that they had become death, destroyer of worlds? Did they ever cry into their pillows at night and contemplate taking their own lives? I didn't have the heart to tell them, apart from my fear that they'd turn me in. Even if I was ultimately correct about all of this, it wouldn't do me or anyone else any good to throw my life away impulsively. I was but one thinking, feeling woman. What the fuck could I do? Maybe if I knew I wasn't alone in this, it'd be a lot easier to speak out. But for now, such action might get me killed, and that would be a stupid, useless way to die. Denial is the most predictable of all human responses, and it takes a great deal of courage to face the shadow of oneself, especially when there lies no promise of reward or comfort on the other end of that dark abyss. And yet, something at the bottom of that infinitely deep well beckons me all the same, that there may in fact be something worthwhile waiting for me on the other side, a light at the end of the tunnel. Great Goddess, protect me from myself and from the priestesses of Maya.
Love shouldn't cost a thing. Tell me what I'm paying for everything. Pretending it's fun. Heaven knows we're forever changing. Heaven knows there's no way to save us. Look at what we have become, empty hearts that spend on. Save yourself, my darling, just begun by morning. After all is said and done, still this war cannot be won. So save yourself, my darling, kill the love that's dying. Look at what we have become, empty hearts that spend on one. Save yourself, my darling, kill the love that's died.